He was just a single dad, trying to fix up an old bike for his daughter's birthday. A final loving touch on a rusted frame. What he didn't know was that the woman watching him from the art gallery across the street was a reclusive billionaire. And she was about to change his life with a single anonymous gift. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from the late afternoon sun slanted through the grimy window of the workshop, casting long golden fingers across the dusty concrete floor? The air hung thick with the familiar scents of sawdust, old oil, and something metallic and sharp, the smell of forgotten things waiting to be remembered. Leo Morgan knelt on the floor, his knees cushioned by a folded piece of cardboard, his focus narrowed to the small silver bicycle frame resting in front of him. It was rusted in places, the paint chipped and faded to a pale ghost of its original sky blue. But to Leo, it was a canvas. He ran a callous thumb over a patch of rough metal feeling, the grit and decay that had settled in over the years. His hands, though stained with grease and marked by 100 small scars, moved with the gentle precision of a surgeon. Each stroke of the sandpaper was slow, deliberate, a conversation with the tired steel. He was coaxing the bike back to life, not just for anyone, but for Maya, his daughter, who was turning 8 in 3 days. She had seen the bike at a garage sale last month, tucked behind a stack of yellowed newspapers and a box of mismatched china. Her eyes had lit up with that pure, undiluted joy that only a child can summon, a joy that had become the sole anchor in Leo's world. He couldn't afford a new bike. Not this year, not with the way the restoration work had dried up. The custom furniture commissions that used to pay the bills had dwindled to small repair jobs, patching chair, legs, fixing wobbly tables enough to keep the lights on and the fridge from going completely bare, but never enough to get ahead. So this bike, this forgotten relic, was his promise. It was his way of saying, I see you, I love you, I will always find a way to give you magic. Even if I have to build it from rust and scraps a few feet away. Maya sat on an overturned paint, her legs swinging happily as she colored in a worn-out book. The tips of her crayons were broken, but she didn't seem to mind. She hummed a tuneless song, a soft buzzing counterpoint to the rhythmic rasp of Leo's sanding. Every so often she'd look up, her brown eyes bright with curiosity and unwavering faith. Daddy, will it be ready? She'd asked an hour ago for the 3rd time, and each time Leo had smiled and nodded. It'll be perfect, kiddo, he'd promised, and he meant it. It would be perfect because it was a piece of him, a testament to the fact that love wasn't measured in price tags, but in time, patience, and the quiet determination to make something beautiful out of what the world had thrown away across the street, in a gallery so clean and white it felt like a room from another dimension. Clara Vance stood motionless, a ghost in a world of polished concrete and abstract art. She wasn't looking at the stark canvases that hung on the walls, each worth more than Leo's workshop and the Worsen heat building it was in. She was looking through the floor-to-ceiling window at the small, dusty garage across the way, at the man on his knees, and the little girl humming on a paint can. She'd bought the gallery a month ago on a whim, another acquisition in a life filled with them. A quiet place to disappear in a small town that didn't know her name. She'd told her board she was scouting for emerging artists, a lie they'd accepted because it sounded profitable. The truth was, she was running. She had been running for a year, from the noise, from the betrayal, from the suffocating weight of being an asset instead of a person. She'd come here for silence, but what she'd found in the golden light of that dusty garage was something else entirely, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a quiet, unwilling ache of recognition. She watched the man's hands, his careful, methodical movements, the way he handled the rusted frame like it was precious. She watched the little girl who looked up at him not with impatience but with complete and utter trust. It was a world away from her own, a world of boardrooms and backstabbing, a world where every gesture was calculated, and every gift came with strings. Here, in this small sunlit frame of a window, there were no strings. just the quiet labor of a father's love, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara Vance felt the sharp, painful pang of wanting to be a part of it. The sanding was done. Leo ran his hand over the now smooth metal. A satisfied sigh escaping his lips, the rust was gone. Replaced by a dull but promising sheen, he stood stretching his back as a chorus of small pops and cracks echoed in the quiet workshop. Maya looked up from her coloring book, her head tilted. "Is it shiny now?" "Almost," he said with a grin. "Now, for the fun part." He pulled a small can of paint from the shelf, a vibrant robin's egg blue he'd bought with the last of his spare cash. It had been a choice between the paint and a full tank of gas he'd chosen. The paint gas would have to wait. He laid out old newspapers on the floor, a protective shield against the splatters that were sure to come. Maya scrambled over her eyes, wide with excitement. "Can I help just a little?" He hesitated, then handed her a small, clean brush. "You can." "Paint the bell." The bell was a tiny silver thing tarnished with age, but it still had a faint, cheerful ring. When he flicked it with his finger, Maya took it with the seriousness of a master artist, dipping the brush carefully into the can and, applying a single steady stroke of blue, a dot of paint landed on her nose, but she was too focused to notice. Leo smiled watching her. It was moments like these that stitched his world together, the small, quiet joys that cost nothing but meant everything. His late wife had been the artist in the family. She could find beauty in anything. A discarded bottle, a fallen leaf, a cracked sidewalk. She had taught him to see the world, not for what it was, but for what it could be. And in Maya, he saw that same spark, that same ability to find magic in the mundane. He shook the can and began to spray the frame. The blue paint, misting out in a fine cloud, transforming the dull silver into something bright and new. The scent filled the workshop, sharp and clean, the smell of a new beginning from her silent perch across the street. Clara watched the transformation. The bike going from a relic to a promise. She saw the little girl's focused expression, the dot of blue paint on her nose, the way the man smiled at her with a kind of weary adoration. It was a small, perfect diorama of a life she didn't know. A life that felt more real, more substantial than the one she was living in her minimalist hotel suite. With its view of nothing but the cold, indifferent sky, she had everything anyone could ever want, and yet watching them, she felt a profound and startling emptiness. She had forgotten what it was like to build something with her own hands, to create something for someone else out of pure affection. The last thing she had built was a multi-billion-dollar software platform that had been used to gut smaller companies, and the last gift she had received was a diamond bracelet. From a man who had sold her company's secrets to a competitor 3 weeks later, she turned away from the window. The scene in the workshop was too bright, too honest. It made the shadows in her own life feel darker and colder than ever before. But she couldn't erase the image, the man, the girl, the blue paint. It was burned into her mind, a quiet accusation, a silent question. What was she building? What was she creating? Who was she doing it? For the answer was a hollow echo. In the stark white gallery, nothing, no one, nobody. The bike was finished. It stood gleaming in the center of the workshop, propped up by a kickstand that Leo had spent an hour polishing. The blue frame shone like a piece of the summer sky. Its new white basket was woven from plastic he'd repurposed from old shipping straps, and the bell, a tiny blue jewel, now rang with a clear, bright chime. It wasn't a new bike. It still had the gentle imperfections of something with a past, a history, a story. But it was beautiful. It was loved. Leo stood back, his arms crossed, a tired but deep satisfaction settling in his chest. Maya's birthday was tomorrow, and for the first time in weeks he felt a flicker of something. Close to peace, he had managed to pull it off, to create a little bit of magic in a world that had felt relentlessly gray. The next morning, Maya's gasp was all the thanks he needed. Her eyes went wide, her hands flew to her mouth, and she circled the bike like it was a sacred object, a treasure, unearthed from a forgotten tomb. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "It's the most beautiful bike in the whole world." She threw her arms around his waist, hugging him with a strength that belied her small frame. Leo hugged her back tightly, burying his face in her hair and breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the lingering sweetness of the pancakes he'd made for her birthday breakfast. "This," he thought. "This is what it's all about. This is the reason for all of it." They spent the morning in the park, Maya wobbling down the path on her new bike, her laughter echoing through the trees. Leo ran alongside her, one hand hovering near the back of the seat, ready to steady her, but she didn't need it. She was flying free and unafraid, on a machine born of rust and love. Later that day, they walked back to the workshop, hand in hand, Maya pushing the bike proudly beside them. As they approached, Leo noticed a large box sitting on the doorstep. It was sleek and black, tied with a silver ribbon with no label, no return address, no indication of where it had come from. He frowned. Who would have sent them? A package. He didn't know anyone who used couriers. He crouched down and examined the box, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Maya peered over his shoulder, her eyes curious. "What is it?" He shook his head. "I don't know." He slit in the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of white tissue paper, was a helmet. A state-of-the-art piece of gear, impossibly light, with a glossy finish that matched the bike's blue paint perfectly underneath it. Lay a set of matching knee pads, elbow pads, and a brand new silver horn that looked like something out of a futuristic movie. Maya's eyes were like saucers, but Leo's gaze was fixed on the small, cream-colored envelope tucked into the corner. He opened it with a sense of dread. The card inside was made of thick, expensive paper, and the handwriting was elegant and restrained. It read, "A brave knight. Needs proper armor. Happy birthday to a girl with a very special dad." There was no signature, no name, just those quiet, enigmatic words. Leo's heart sank. It was a kind gesture, a thoughtful one, but it felt like an intrusion, a judgment on the simple world he had so carefully built. It felt like pity, and there was nothing Leo hated more than pity. He closed the box and looked across the street to the stark white gallery. Its windows were empty, reflecting the sky, but he felt like he was being watched, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that the gift had come from there, from the silent watcher who had seen his struggle and decided to intervene. The weight of the anonymous gift sat heavy in Leo's chest. For the rest of the day, it was a paradox. Kindness that felt like a critique. Every time he looked at the gleaming new helmet, it seemed to mock the hand-painted bell on Maya's bike. The state-of-the-art horn felt like a judgment on the simple joy of her own laughter. He couldn't explain it to Maya, who saw only the magic of a surprise gift. She kept picking up the helmet, turning it over in her small hands. Her face, a mixture of awe and confusion. "Daddy, are we going to keep it?" she asked her voice small. He looked at her, at the hopeful light in her eyes, and the knot in his stomach tightened. "We're going to say thank you," he said finally, his voice more firm than he felt. "We're going to find out who sent it, and thank them properly." The next morning, he packed the box back up, carefully arranging the tissue paper. Just as he had found it, he held Maya's hand as they crossed the quiet street, the bell on the gallery door chiming softly as they stepped inside. The space was even more sterile. Up close, the white walls were vast and empty, save for a few large abstract paintings that seemed to absorb all the sound. The air was cool and still, and smelled faintly of paint and money. A woman sat behind a great-as-say, minimalist white desk at the far end of the room. She looked up as they entered, her expression calm and unreadable. It was Clara. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked elegant, composed, and completely out of place, in a town where the most common fashion accessory was a pair of work boots. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a certain authority. Leo walked toward her, placing the box on the desk between them. "I think "This belongs to you," he said, his tone even but firm. Clara's gaze flickered to the box, then back to him. She didn't deny it, she didn't pretend to be surprised. "I believe it belongs to the birthday girl," she replied, her voice just as steady. Leo shook his head. "We appreciate the thought, it was very generous. But we can't accept it." "Why not?" Clara asked, her eyes searching his face for an answer he wouldn't give. "Because we don't take gifts from strangers," he said. It was a lie of omission. He knew she wasn't a complete stranger, she was the woman who had been watching him. But he couldn't bring himself to say that, not in front of Maya, who stood clutching his leg, her eyes darting between the two adults. Sensing the tension in the air, Clara's expression softened slightly. She looked at Maya, then back at Leo. "It wasn't meant to be anything more than a gift," she said. "A celebration of a beautiful bike, and the girl who rides it." Leo's jaw tightened. "I know, but some things are more complicated than they look." He slid the box a little closer to her. "We just came to say thank you." And to return it, he took Maya's hand and turned to leave the bell. Chiming their exit, Clara watched them go. Her hands resting on the cool surface of the desk, she hadn't expected him to return it. She hadn't expected him to look her in the eye with that quiet, unyielding pride. She had tried to offer a simple kindness, but she had misjudged him. She had seen a man in need and offered a solution, but he wasn't looking for a solution, he was looking for respect. She watched him walk away, his daughter's hand in his, and for the waterbowl ache. Second time in as many days, she felt that familiar ache of loneliness, but this time it was mixed with something else? Something she hadn't felt in a long time. A flicker of admiration. Leo didn't talk about the woman in the gallery on the walk home. Maya was quiet, too. Sensing that the topic was a closed door, she held his hand a little tighter. Her small fingers wrapped around his, as if to reassure him that she was still there, that nothing had really changed, but something had. Leo felt it like a shift in the air, a new variable in an equation he thought he had solved. The woman's face lingered in his mind, her calm eyes, her quiet confidence, the way she had looked at him, not with pity, but with a kind of clinical curiosity, like he was a puzzle she was trying to figure out. He tried to push it out of his head to focus on the work that was piling up in the shop. A broken chair, a wobbly bookshelf, a vintage dresser that needed a new coat of varnish, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the white gallery and the woman inside. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the anonymous gift was just the beginning of something he wasn't prepared for. A few days later, a delivery truck, a sleek black van with no logos, pulled up in front of the workshop. Leo was in the middle of staining the dresser, his hands covered in a dark walnut finish, when the driver, a man in a crisp uniform, knocked on the open-door. "Package for Leo Morgan," he said, holding out a slim flat box. Leo frowned. "I didn't order anything." The driver shrugged and handed him a clipboard. "Sign here." Leo wiped his hands on a rag and scribbled his name, his sense of unease growing. He took the box. It was light, almost weightless. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, a beautifully rendered architectural drawing of a bicycle, a vintage model from the 1950s, with elegant curved lines and intricate details. It was a work of art, a schematic that was both technical and beautiful. Underneath it was a small note in the same elegant handwriting as before. "I thought a master craftsman might appreciate the original design." No signature, just the quiet offering. Leo stared at the drawing, his breath catching in his throat. It was a stunning piece of history, a design he had only seen in old books. He ran his fingers over the embossed lines, feeling the texture of the paper, the precision of the ink. It was a gift again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a solution to a problem he didn't have. It was a gesture of respect, a recognition of his craft, of who he was. It was a peace offering, and it was far more dangerous than the helmet had ever been. He looked across the street at the gallery. Its windows were empty, but he knew she was there, watching, waiting, and he knew with a sinking feeling that he was going to have to talk to her again, because this time he didn't want to return the gift, and that scared him. More than anything, the architectural drawing of the vintage bicycle remained on Leo's workbench for days, propped up against a jar of brushes, like a silent sentinel. He found himself looking at it more often than he cared to admit, his eyes tracing the elegant lines of the frame, the intricate details of the gears and pedals. It was a masterclass in design, a thing of beauty and precision, and it had been sent to him by a woman. He barely knew a woman, who seemed to see him more clearly than most people who had known him for years. The gesture had disarmed him. The helmet had been an act of charity, a rich person's solution to a poor person's problem. But this was different. This was a conversation. Started in a language, he understood the language of craftsmanship, of history, of things made with care and intention. It was a subtle acknowledgement of his skill, a nod from one artist to another, and it made the wall he had, so carefully constructed around himself, feel suddenly flimsy and thin. Maya was fascinated by the drawing. She would stand on her tiptoes, her small fingers hovering just above the paper, careful not to touch it. "Daddy, who made this?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. "I don't know who drew it, kiddo," he'd replied. "But it was a long time ago, by someone who really loved bikes. He didn't tell her it had come from the woman in the gallery. He didn't want to complicate her world with a tangled mess of his own feelings, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. The drawing was a question hanging in the air, and he was going to have to answer it one afternoon as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. He made a decision. He carefully rolled up the drawing, slid it into a protective tube, and walked across the street. The bell on the gallery door chimed its familiar soft greeting. Clara was standing near the back of the gallery, her back to him, staring at a large canvas of swirling blues and grays. She didn't turn around right away, as if she had been expecting him. She knew the sound of his footsteps. "Now I came to say, thank you," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm glad you liked it." He held up the tube. "I do. It's beautiful." But I have to ask why. Her eyes held his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something beyond her calm composure, something vulnerable. "Because I was wrong," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I offered you a solution when you weren't asking for one. I disrespected your craft and your pride. I wanted to apologize in a way that you might actually hear." Leo was taken aback. Her directness was as sharp and clean as the lines on the drawing. He hadn't expected an apology. He hadn't known what to expect. But it wasn't this. He nodded slowly, accepting her words without argument. There was a long pause between them, the silence filled with the unspoken weight of their two different worlds. "Why a gallery in a town like this?" he asked, finally changing the subject. "Because I was tired of a world that only values what's new," she replied, her gaze drifting back to the painting. "I wanted to be somewhere that appreciated things with a history, things that were built to last." Her words hung in the air, a quiet confession, and Leo realized with a startling clarity that she wasn't just talking about paintings or bicycles. She was talking about herself. And maybe, just maybe, she was talking about him too. Leo found himself drawn to the gallery more often than he should have been. He told himself it was for research, to study the lines and forms of the art, to find inspiration for his own restoration work, but that was a lie. He went to see her. He would stand for long stretches in front of a painting, pretending to be lost in its composition while he watched her. From the corner of his eye, she moved through the gallery with a quiet grace, a sense of purpose that was both intimidating and alluring. She rarely had customers. The gallery was more of a private sanctuary than a commercial enterprise. But she treated every piece of art with a reverence that Leo understood on a cellular level. One rainy afternoon, he brought her a cup of coffee from the diner. Down the street, it was a simple gesture, an offering of warmth on a cold day away of continuing the conversation they had started without needing words, she accepted it with a small, surprised smile, and they stood together near the front window, watching the rain streak down the glass. They didn't talk about their pasts or their problems. They talked about the way the artist of a particular sculpture had captured the feeling of movement in static metal. They talked about the lost art of joinery, the beauty of a hand-planed piece of wood. In these moments, the chasm between their worlds seemed to shrink. The polished CEO and the dusty craftsman found a common language in their shared appreciation for things made with soul and skill. Maya often tagged along. She would sit in a corner of the gallery with a sketchbook and a set of charcoal pencils that Clara had given her, trying to replicate the shapes and shadows she saw around her. Clara never treated her like a child to be tolerated. She would kneel beside her and talk to her about perspective, and light, her voice soft and encouraging. Leo would watch them, a quiet ache in his chest. He saw the way Maya's face lit up in Clara's presence, the way she blossomed under the quiet attention of a woman who saw her as a budding artist, not just a little girl. It was a dangerous thing to watch, to let himself feel the fragile tendrils of hope beginning to take root in the barren ground of his heart. He knew he should be careful. He knew that a woman like Clara, with her mysterious past and her quiet wealth, was not someone who was likely to stay in a small, forgotten town like his. But every time he looked at her, every time he saw the genuine warmth in her eyes, when she smiled at Maya, he found it harder and harder to remember why he should be afraid he was falling for her. Not for the woman of mystery and means, but for the woman who saw beauty in old things, who understood the language of his hands, and who made his daughter laugh with a joy that felt like sunshine after a long rain. And he knew with a terrifying certainty that if she left, she would take a piece of his world with her. The first time Clara stepped into Leo's workshop, it felt like a collision of two universes. The space was a chaotic symphony of his life. Wood shavings curled on the floor like fallen leaves. Tools lay scattered across the workbench in a way that only made sense to him, and the air was thick with the scent of varnish and hard work. Clara stood in the doorway, her simple but elegant clothes, a stark contrast to the beautiful mess around her. She looked around not with judgment or disdain, but with a kind of quiet wonder, as if she had stumbled into a secret garden. "This is where the magic happens," she said, her voice soft. Leo chuckled, wiping his hands on an old rag. "It's where the dust happens." Mostly, she smiled, and stepped inside, her fingers trailing lightly over a stack of reclaimed oak. He was planning to turn into a table you see potential in. "Things people throw away," she observed. "It's not about potential," he said. "It's about seeing the story that's already there. Everything has a story. You just have to be quiet enough to listen for it." She looked at him, then really looked, and he felt that familiar jolt of being seen too clearly. He changed the subject, quickly gesturing to a half-finished rocking horse in the corner. "That's my next project for Maya. She's been asking for one for months." Clara walked over and ran her hand over the smooth, curved wood of the horse's neck. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I had one like this when I was a little girl. My grandfather made it for me. It was the only thing I took with me when I left home." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile offering. Leo didn't press for details. He didn't ask what home she had left or why. He just nodded, understanding that some stories were too heavy to be told all at once. Instead, he picked up a piece of sandpaper and handed it to her. "Want to help?" he asked, his voice gentle. She took at her fingers, brushing his, and for a long moment their eyes met in that shared space of sawdust and sunlight. She hesitated, then knelt beside him and began to sand the rough edges of the rocking horse. Her movements were clumsy at first, but she learned quickly, her focus intense and unwavering. They worked in silence for a while. The only forehead sound the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper on wood. It was a comfortable silence, a working silence, the kind of quiet that builds things instead of breaking them down. Maya came in a little later, her eyes widening when she saw Clara on the floor beside her father. Her face broke into a wide grin. "Miss Clara, you're helping Daddy build my horse?" Clara looked up, a smudge of sawdust on her cheek and a genuine smile on her face. "I am," she said, "and I think it's the most important. The work I've done in a very long time." Leo watched them, the two most important people in his world, side by side, and felt a wave of something so fierce and hopeful it almost knocked him off his feet. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if this fragile peace would last, but in that moment, surrounded by the scent of wood and the sound of their quiet work, he felt something he hadn't felt since his wife was alive. He felt like he was home. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, a quiet melody composed of 3 different notes that were somehow finding their harmony. Clara became a regular presence in the workshop. She would bring coffee in the morning and sit with her sketchbook. While Leo worked sometimes, she would help sanding or staining or just holding a piece of wood steady. Her presence was a quiet anchor in his day, a calm port in the storm of his worries. Maya adored her. She would save her best drawings to show Clara her most exciting stories from school. Clara listened with a patience and genuine interest that made Maya feel seen and valued in a way that few adults ever had one. Saturday they all went to the farmer's market together. Maya ran ahead, darting between stalls of fresh produce and homemade jams, while Leo and Clara followed at a slower pace. The townspeople watched them with a mixture of curiosity and quiet approval. They had started to see Clara not as the mysterious woman in the gallery, but as the kind woman who bought flowers from old Mrs. Henderson and always had a smile for the children. Leo felt the shift, too. The way people's gazes softened when they saw them together, the way the whispers had turned from speculation to something that sounded more like hope. He found himself relaxing his guard, letting the walls around his heart crumble just a little bit. He started to talk to her about his wife, not in a way that was heavy with grief, but with a quiet nostalgia, sharing stories of her art, her laughter, her unwavering belief in him. Clara listened without judgment, her eyes full of a deep and compassionate understanding. She in turn began to share small pieces of her own story, a childhood spent in cavernous houses with absent parents, a career built on ambition, and a desperate need to prove her worth, a betrayal that had shattered her trust in people and in herself. They were two broken people finding solace in each other's company. Two lonely souls, discovering that they were not as alone as they thought they were one evening. As they sat on the porch of the workshop, watching the sun set behind the distant hills, Clara turned to him, her expression serious. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice quiet. Leo's heart gave a slight lurch. He braced himself for the confession. He had been dreading the news that she was leaving, that this was all just a temporary escape from a life he could never be a part of. "My full name is Clara Vance," she said, and the name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I own Vance Technologies, a software company." He stared at her. The name was familiar. He'd seen it in business magazines at the library, headlines about innovation and market disruption, and the reclusive genius CEO, who rarely made public appearances. It all clicked into place. The gallery, the expensive clothes, the quiet air of authority. She was not just wealthy. She was a titan of industry, a woman who moved in circles. He could barely imagine. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at her, at the vulnerability in her eyes. The fear of his reaction. She had not told him to impress him. She had told him because she trusted him, and in that moment he realized that he didn't care about the money or the fame or the company. He cared about the woman in front of him, the woman who had a smudge of paint on her cheek and a heart that was just as bruised and beautiful as his own. "Does that change anything?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "It doesn't," he said, and he meant it. The revelation of Clara's identity settled between them, not as a wall, but as a bridge. Leo found that it changed very little about how he saw her. She was still the woman who brought him coffee, who helped him sand rocking horses, who listened to Maya's stories with rapt attention. The billionaire CEO was just Another layer of a complex and fascinating person. He was getting to know the town, however, was a different story. The news trickled out slowly at first, a whispered rumor at the diner, a speculative post on a local community forum, but then, freelance journalist on vacation in a nearby town caught wind of the story, and the dam broke the headline. On the online tabloid was sensational and cruel. Tech titan Clara Vance hiding out with small-town carpenter, a blue-collar romance. Or a billionaire's new pet project. The story was accompanied by a grainy, long-lens photo of Leo and Clara sitting on the workshop porch. Their hands intertwined. The invasion was swift and brutal. Reporters started showing up in town their cars with out-of-state plates. Lining the street outside the workshop, they shouted questions at Leo when he tried to go to the grocery store. They hounded the other shopkeepers for comments. They even tried to talk to Maya. On her way home from school, that was the moment Leo's protective instincts went into overdrive. He shielded Maya from the cameras, his face a mask of cold fury, and ushered her inside the workshop, slamming the door behind them. The sanctuary he had so carefully built had been breached, its peace shattered by the harsh glare of a world that didn't understand or care about the quiet beauty of what they were building. Clara was devastated. She locked herself in. The gallery refusing to answer calls or speak to the press, she watched from the window as the media circus descended on Leo's life, turning his quiet dignity into a spectacle. She saw the fear in his eyes, the way he held Maya close as if to shield her from the storm that she had brought to his doorstep. She felt a suffocating wave of guilt. She had run away from her world to find peace, but she had only succeeded in dragging it with her, destroying the very thing she had come to admire. That evening, she went to the workshop. The reporters had finally dispersed, leaving behind a trail of cigarette butts and a palpable sense of violation. Leo was sitting on the steps, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached, his eyes full of a pain that cut her to the core. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this to happen." "I know," he said, his voice hoarse, "but it did happen. Clara and I don't know how to protect her from it." He gestured toward the workshop where Maya was asleep on a cot in the back room. "This is my fault," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I should have stayed away. I should have never let it get this far." Leo stood and walked toward her. He didn't touch her, he just stood there, his presence, a heavy weight in the charged air. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Maybe this was a mistake." The words hung between them, a death sentence to the fragile hope they had nurtured. She looked at him, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She had come to him, looking for a lifeline, and she had ended up being the anchor that was pulling him under. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Leo alone with the wreckage of their two worlds. The silence that followed Clara's departure was heavier and more suffocating than any Leo had ever known. The reporters eventually grew bored and moved on to their next story, leaving the town of Oak Creek to its quiet rhythms. But the scars of their invasion remained. The townsfolk were kind but cautious. Their glances now held a trace of pity that Leo couldn't bear. His business slowed to a trickle. The curious onlookers had been replaced by a quiet void, and the phone in the workshop rarely rang. Leo tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. For Maya's sake, he made pancakes in the morning. He helped her with her homework. He even finished the rocking horse, sanding its surface to a glassy smoothness and painting it with intricate flowers like his wife used to do, but his heart wasn't in it. The joy had been leached out of his work. Replaced by a dull mechanical ache, he would find himself staring across the street at the gallery, its white facade. Now looking cold and abandoned, Clara had left town the day after their last conversation. The sign on the door simply read, "Closed until further notice." Maya was the one who felt the loss. Most acutely she had grown quiet, her bright spark dimmed. She would sit in the workshop with her sketchbook, but the pages remained blank. She missed Clara's quiet encouragement, her warm smile, the way she made her feel like the most important artist in the world. One afternoon, Maya came to him with a drawing in her hand. It was a picture of the three of them in the workshop. Leo was holding a paintbrush. Clara was sanding the rocking horse, and Maya was in the middle, her arms outstretched, reaching for both of them above their heads. She had written a single sentence in her wobbly, childish handwriting. "It's better when we're all here." Leo looked at the drawing, his throat tightening until it ached. He had pushed Clara away to protect his daughter, but in doing so, he had taken away a source of her joy. He had built a wall to keep the world out, but he had also trapped them inside with their own loneliness. He had been so focused on the fear of what he could lose that he had failed to see what he had already found. The drawing was a mirror, reflecting his own mistake, and he knew in that moment that he had to fix it. He had to find a way to tear down the walls he had built and let the light back in, even if it meant risking everything he had left. Clara retreated to her glass and steel penthouse in the city, a self-imposed prison, high above the noise of the world she had tried to escape. She threw herself into her work, burying her heartache in code, algorithms, and board meetings. She was brilliant, ruthless, and efficient, and her company's stock soared, but the success felt hollow, a bitter pill she swallowed every morning with her black coffee. She had built an empire of logic and order, but her own life was a chaotic mess of regret and longing. One afternoon, her assistant brought her a package. A simple cardboard tube with no return address inside was Maya's drawing, the three of them in the workshop. The words, "It's better when we're all here," a quiet arrow to the heart. Clara stared at the drawing for a long time, the colors blurring through her tears. She had left to protect them, but she had only ended up hurting them and herself. She had let her fear dictate her actions, and it had led her back to the very emptiness she had tried to run from. That night she made a decision. She called an emergency board meeting and announced that she was stepping back from her role as CEO. She was establishing a foundation, the Vance Foundation for Artisanal Preservation, dedicated to supporting and funding craftsmen and artists who were keeping traditional skills alive. Her board was stunned, but she was resolute. She had spent her life building things that were disposable, things that were designed to become obsolete. She wanted to build something that they would last, something that had soul, something that mattered. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at Leo's workshop. It was from the newly formed Vance Foundation, informing him that he had been awarded a substantial grant to expand his clan workshop and establish an apprenticeship program to teach his craft to a new generation. There was no personal note from Clara, just the official paperwork, but Leo knew it was her way of reaching out, of trying to mend the bridge she had inadvertently burned. He looked around his dusty workshop at the unfinished projects and the silent tools, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of the old hope. He didn't want her money. He didn't want her charity. He wanted her. But he also knew that this grant was more than just a check. It was a message. It was a way of saying, "I see you, I believe in you, and I'm not giving up on us." Leo sat with the grant letter in his hands for a long time, the official language, and the staggering number on the check felt alien, a language from another world. But beneath the corporate jargon, he could read the real message from Clara. It was an apology, a plea, and a promise, all rolled into one. He knew he couldn't accept it, not like this. It would always feel like a transaction, a payment for the pain she had caused. He needed to see her, to talk to her, to close the distance between them with words, not money. He packed a small bag, kissed a sleeping Maya on the forehead, and left a note for his neighbor, asking her to look after her for a day. He drove through the night, the city lights growing brighter. As he left his small town behind, he found her penthouse apartment, listed in a business directory, a sterile glass tower that scraped the sky. He felt small and out of place as he stood in the marble lobby, his worn work boots, a stark contrast to the polished floors, but he didn't let the feeling deter him. He took the elevator to the top floor and knocked on her door. When she opened it, her face was a mask of shock and disbelief. She was dressed in a simple silk robe, her hair undone, her eyes red-rimmed and weary. She looked nothing like the powerful CEO, and everything like the woman he had fallen in love with. "I can't take your money," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She stared at him, her throat working, but no words came out. "I don't want a grant." "Clara," he said, stepping closer, "I want you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out Maya's drawing, unfolding it with care. "This is what's real," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what matters. Not the money, not the headlines, not the two worlds we come from. It's us. It's this." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she looked at the drawing, then back at him. "I thought I had ruined everything," she whispered. "You did," he said with a small sad smile. "And I did too. We were both scared. We both made mistakes. But that doesn't mean we can't fix it." He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was gentle, a familiar anchor in the storm of their emotions. "We can fix it together," he said. And in that moment, in the cold, sterile penthouse, high above the city, they finally found their way back to the warmth of the dusty workshop and the simple truth of their shared love. The gallery in Oak Creek reopened a month later, but it was different. Now the stark white walls were painted in warm, earthy tones, and the abstract art had been replaced with handcrafted furniture, intricate woodwork, and beautiful pieces of restored history. It was a celebration of the craft that had brought them together, a testament to the beauty of things with a past. The sign above the door now read Morgan Vance Restorations, a partnership of two worlds, two souls, two hearts. Leo stood in the center of the gallery, his arm around Clara's waist, watching as Maya proudly showed a customer, a small wooden bird he had carved. Clara had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of her company, focusing her energy on the foundation and the gallery. She had found a new kind of success, one that was measured not in stock prices, but in the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful with the person she loved. The town had embraced them, their story. No longer a scandal, but a local legend. A modern fairy tale that people told with a smile. They were a reminder that love could bridge any divide, that authenticity was more valuable than wealth, and that sometimes the most broken things could be restored to a beauty that was even more profound than before. One evening, as they sat on the workshop porch, watching the stars come out, Maya snuggled between them. She held up the old vintage bicycle drawing that Clara had given Leo so long ago. "Are you going to build this one, Daddy?" she asked. Leo smiled and looked at Clara, who was leaning her head on his shoulder. "Maybe someday," he said, "but we've got a lot of other things to build first." He squeezed Clara's hand and she looked up at him, her eyes full of a love that was as deep and quiet and enduring as the ancient trees that surrounded them. They had found their way back to each other, not by ignoring their differences, but by embracing them. They had built a new life from the pieces of their old ones, a life that was messy and imperfect and prosaic, beautiful. A life that was real, and in the quiet of the evening, with the scent of sawdust in the air and the stars watching over them, they knew they were finally home for good. The story of the craftsman and the billionaire became a quiet cornerstone of the town's lore, told on front porches and at the counter of the local diner. It was a tale that softened with each telling, the sharp edges of the media frenzy and the painful separation giving way to the gentle glow of Badia, the happy ending. But for Leo and Clara, the real story lived in the small moments that no one else saw it, lived in the way she would bring him coffee in the workshop, her hand lingering on his as she passed him the mug. It lived in the way they would leave a small carved flower on her pillow at night, a silent "I love you" in the language of wood. And it lived in the sound of Maya's laughter echoing through their home, a constant reminder of the joy that had brought them together and held them fast. They expanded the workshop, buying the adjacent lot, and building a small but beautiful teaching studio, where Leo held classes for the local youth, passing on the skills that had been his salvation. He be sell taught them to see the story in a piece of wood, to feel the grain beneath their fingers, to have patience with the process of restoration. Clara's foundation flourished, funding similar projects in small towns across the country. She found a new purpose, not in building empires of code, but in preserving the legacies of human hands and hearts. Maya grew up surrounded by love and creativity, her world a beautiful blend of her father's earthy craftsmanship and Clara's quiet elegance. She had the heart of an artist and the soul of an old-world artisan, her hands as comfortable with a paintbrush as they were with a piece of sandpaper. Years later, a young journalist came to town hoping to write a follow-up story. A "Where Are They Now" piece about the scandalous romance that had once captivated the nation. She found Leo and Clara in the workshop working side by side on a large, intricate dining table. Their movements were a fluid dance, a silent conversation of shared purpose and deep affection. The journalist asked them about the challenges they had faced, the chasm between their two worlds. The secret to their unlikely success, Leo looked at Clara and smiled. Slow, warm smile that held the weight of a lifetime of love. The secret, he said, is that there are no two worlds. There's just the one you build together, and ours is built on old wood and a whole lot of trust. And as the journalist packed up her notebook, she realized that the real story wasn't about the billionaire and the carpenter. It was about two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves and had spent the rest of their lives putting them together, creating a love that was stronger and more beautiful than anything they could have ever built alone. The final piece of the story wasn't written in a newspaper or whispered in a diner. It was carved into the underside of the dinner side of the Duminy tennis dining table. They were building a small inscription, almost hidden from view. For Maya, it read, "It was always for you," a testament to the little girl whose simple wish for a bicycle had set in motion a love story for the ages, a story that proved that the greatest treasures are not the ones we buy, but the ones we build with our own two hands, and the love we are brave enough to restore. The community center buzzed with a gentle energy, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings hanging in the air. The grand opening of the Oak Creek Artisanal Guild was a quiet triumph, a testament to the work Leo and Clara had poured their hearts into over the last year. It was a space for local craftsmen to share their Clara skills, a place for kids to learn woodworking, pottery, and weaving, a hub of creativity that had been funded by Clara's foundation but was run with Leo's hands-on philosophy. Leo stood near the back of the room, a cup of punch in his hand, watching as Maya, now a teenager with paint stains on her jeans, confidently explained the process of wood burning to a group of younger children. She had her father's steady hands and her mother's artistic eye. Beautiful fusion of their two worlds. Clara moved through the crowd with an easy grace, no longer the guarded CEO, but a beloved member of the community. She stopped to chat with the mayor, to admire a young girl's lopsided clay pot, and to share a laugh with the elderly woman who taught the weaving class. She caught Leo's eye from across the room, and her smile was a silent conversation, a shared acknowledgement of how far they had come. Later that evening, after the last guest had gone, and the center was quiet, they walked home, hand in hand, under a sky full of stars. The air was cool and crisp, and the silence was a comfortable blanket between them. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I used to think my legacy would be a software company, a line of code that changed the way people did business." Leo squeezed her hand. "And what do you think it is now?" She looked at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "I think it's this," she said, gesturing to the quiet town around them. The laughter of a child, learning a new skill, the satisfaction of a craftsman, seeing his work, valued the feeling of coming home to a person who sees all your broken pieces and loves you, not in spite of them, but because of them. They stopped in front of their house, the lights glowing warmly in the windows. Leo turned to her and pulled her close, his hands resting on her waist. "I love you, Clara Vance," he said, his voice full of a raw and unwavering emotion. "And I love you, Leo Morgan," she replied, resting her forehead against his. More than any empire, more than any headline, more than any world I left behind. And in the quiet of that small-town night, surrounded by the life they had built, together, they knew that their love story was not a fairy tale. It was something far better, it was real, and it was forever. Their legacy wasn't in the buildings they built, or the money they gave it, was in the quiet truth that love, when it's real and patient and brave, has the power to restore not just old wood and rusted metal, but the human heart itself. And that was a legacy that would last for generations to come. A story whispered on the wind, a testament to the enduring power of a craftsman's hands and a billionaire's heart, finding their way home to each other against all odds. A story that started with a simple blue bike and ended with a love that was as timeless and beautiful as the stars above. The end was really just the beginning of a lifetime of quiet, beautiful moments, a legacy not of wealth but of worthiness. A home built not of glass and steel, but of trust, sawdust, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves a place to belong.